They, after 1971, they just used treasury bills, which was bad, but still there was some restraint on that. That depended on the amount of debt that we had. But of course, that gave license to the Congress to run up unlimited amount of debt. But today, what backs our dollar is derivatives. All the worthless assets, the toxic assets that we were required to buy are now held by the Fed, and we don't know exactly how much and what they have bought, and that, of course, is why we're arguing for the case of auditing the Fed. But the next Federal Reserve Board chairman that I had some confrontations with and discussion with was Alan Greenspan. And I tell the story in there about the time, I think most of you here in this audience would know the story that Alan Greenspan, of course, was a supporter of and a friend of Ayn Rand, and he was in their little group of people. But in the 1960s, he wrote this fantastic article about how bad debt was and how bad the central bank was, and that we confiscated wealth by printing money. I mean, it's a wonderful article. And so we had one session one morning before we were going to the banking committee, and it was to go in and personally say hello to the Federal Reserve Board chairman because he was getting ready to testify and get a picture with him. So I thought I would do that, and it had been scheduled. So I dug up an old copy of the Objectivist newsletter where the original article appeared on the gold standard. So I dug that out and I took it with me, and when I was meeting him, I pulled it out and I showed him. I said, "Do you recognize this newsletter?" "Oh yeah, I recognize that." So I had it and I flipped it open to that particular article, and I said, "You remember this article?" He said, "Oh yeah, I remember that article." And I said, "Would you mind signing this? And would you autograph this article for me?" So he took his pen out and signed it, and I said, "Would you want to add a disclaimer on this?" He says, "Oh no," and he said something amazing to me. He says, "No," he says, "just reread that recently and fully endorses everything that he wrote back then." So, but now that he's out of being the chairman, the other day I saw him say something favorable toward gold. So maybe he's going back to his roots, who knows. But he had his chance. He had his chance to talk about sound money, and I think he, of course, contributed so much to the financial bubble that we have. Now, Bernanke, of course, is, I would consider him a little less friendly. So I would, you know, even though I had the disagreements with Alan Greenspan, I would say he was a little more cordial than Bernanke. But I write about these stories and then repeat some of the conversations I've had with Bernanke and Greenspan, and give you information about that. But the rest of the book deals with you know, why we should get rid of the Fed and why the Fed doesn't deserve to exist. And a pretty important reason, although I consider it today under current conditions probably the weakest argument, and that's rather sad, and that is the constitutional argument. I mean, if I wanted to get somewhere in Washington and say the reason we have to get rid of the Federal Reserve is because of our respect for the Constitution doesn't give us authority, forget it. It doesn't work that way. They don't want to hear that, and they would say, "Oh no, the courts say it's okay." Oh, okay, the courts can rewrite the Constitution. And the courts have always favored central banking, and they've always favored the government over the people. So whether it's gold clause contracts or whatever, they just cancel the agreement. Oh, the government doesn't have to pay in gold just because they promised to pay in gold. They just cancel it. So instead of the government guaranteeing contracts, the government uses the courts to abuse the contracts and stick it to the people, so the people aren't you know, rewarded as they should be. So the constitutional argument is a weak argument, but for those who believe the Constitution should be interpreted by what does it say, and it says that we're not allowed to do anything unless we're authorized to do it. There's a lot of prohibitions in the Constitution, and that which was not permitted was denied. So there's no provision in there that the Congress now has the authority to set up a central bank. And yet that argument and debate started right after the Constitution, and of course, even back then, the courts ruled favorably for the First National Bank. But there is no authority to set up a central bank, and there is a monetary provision, and that is that Congress is to deal with coinage. We have the authority and the responsibility to coin silver and gold as legal tender, and the states were prohibited from doing anything else because the states, even before the Constitutional Convention, were very much involved in printing money and being very inflationary. So the states weren't allowed to print their own paper money. They were to use only gold and silver. But today, if an individual or a state demanded that you use gold and silver, you're liable to go to jail. So it's been turned on its head. It's the loose interpretation of the Constitution, the willingness to go along with the court to just obliterate the whole idea of honest money as was provided for us in the Constitution. But the responsibility for monetary policy really falls within the Congress. But some interpret that as to say that Congress then should be the one who gets to print the money and distribute the money, sort of the populist position. I don't endorse that, although I endorse the idea that Congress should have more responsibility in order to have sound money, but we really don't have license to inflate the currency. The Congress does not have that authority, and yet we still have, matter of fact, some allies who would undo the Federal Reserve, and they would have the audit of the Fed, but they would just as soon turn over the monetary authorities, the monetary power to the Congress, but that certainly wouldn't solve the problem. So the Constitution did not serve us well in preventing what the founders wanted us to prevent, and that is to have a paper currency. They talked about emitting bills of credit. To them, that was paper money, and that's prohibited. And so we're doing exactly that, and of course that's the reason that we're in so much financial trouble right now and approaching a dollar crisis. The second argument that I use against the Fed is the Moore argument, and that's not much stronger in Washington than the Constitution argument. They don't want to hear anything about that either. But there's a moral argument against the Federal Reserve because we're giving power to a few individuals to create money out of thin air and have legal tender laws that says you must use the paper money. You can't use gold as the Constitution tells you you should, but you must use paper money. And then that gives the central bank the authority to counterfeit money. And always for good reasons, of course, to maintain a stable economy. So the Fed was given this authority, to have a stable currency, but they did this through the counterfeiting process. Now, most of you here probably remember the story of the law, Bastiat's law, and the whole theme of the law is that if you have a moral principle behind the law, it should be that if you as an individual can't do something to or against your neighbor, you can't get the government to do it either. The government should have to stand with the same moral principles. So if you're not permitted under any system of government, in particular ours, to steal from your neighbor, if your neighbor has 3 cars and you have none, nobody says you have a right to go in and just take your car and say, I need a car, I'm going to take your car, Fortunately, we still call that theft. But what we do is not a whole lot better. What we do is we get the majority together, and the majority comes down and say, well, a person with 3 cars, that's unfair, so therefore we have to take a car from you and give it to somebody else who needs a car, because needs now are rights. So who does that? If you're not allowed to steal a car, you send somebody from Washington, somebody from the government, to go and steal one car and transfer that, and so that's how the whole transfer system comes about. And it's immoral. It's immoral, and if you would think that would be enough. If the Constitution is too weak, why couldn't we accept this whole idea of morality? But unfortunately, what happens is the opposition grabs the moral high ground. They say, well, it's only moral to take care of people who need something, and needs are rights, demands become rights, and we have this whole notion that the only way you can have a fair and prosperous society is the use of force by government to redistribute wealth. And if you can do that with the central bank in an immoral way to create new money and then distribute it, what happens, though, of course, is the money gets distributed to their friends rather than the people who are supposed to get help, and it's a total failure. Now, another argument that I have against the central bank